In his new book, The New Class War, Saving Democracy from the Managerial Elite, Michael Lind attributes the current state of American politics and President Trump's 2016 victory to the feat of the so-called managerial elite.
So he joins us now to discuss the book and the economic anxiety he says is dominating our politics. Michael, it's great to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for being here.
So it's interesting, Michael, you have this new book which kind of lays out a thesis for how to settle what is this new class war, and you really blame put the blame at the feet of the managerial elite. But what does that mean? I mean, we talk about here the professional managerial class. Who are they? What do they do, and why are they responsible for where we are right now?
Well, I build on the argument of James Burnham, the ex-Trotskyist who became a founder of American conservatism in the 1940s, that the successor to the classic owner-operator, small business capitalist elite in the 19th century was not going to be the proletariat, the working class. It was going to be this new managerial class, which he defined very broadly to include not only corporate managers, but also government officials, nonprofit executives, even military officers. And arguably, that group was restrained for decades after World War II by institutions that amplified the power of the working class, that is, trade unions, powerful churches, and local political machines. All three of those institutions have atrophied since the 1970s, and the result, whether intended or not, has been increasing concentration of power in the top 30% who are college educated, and particularly in the top 10% or so who have graduate and professional degrees.
Yeah.
Anand Giridharadas reviewed your book for the New York Times. He didn't like it that much. One of the critiques that he said is that you had an outdated view of who is in the working class. So just explain, what is your view of the working class? Who comprises the working class?
Well, I define class not in terms of money, but in terms of credentials, because educational credentials are the real basis of access to organizational power, whether in the government or in the private sector, in the nonprofit sector nowadays. So a high school educated person, by my definition, that's about 2/3 of the population,
right,
is working class. Now, you can have a plumbing contractor who makes $200,000 a year.
Sure.
He's a working class plumbing contractor who's rich.
So implicit in what Anand is saying here is that you're only focusing on white people, and especially white men. I mean, do you think that's fair, or how would you respond?
He's a liar. In my book, I say constantly, every time I describe the working class in the United States and Europe, that it is disproportionately, but not exclusively, native and white. And particularly if you look at Britain, 1/3 of black and Middle Eastern voters in Britain voted for Brexit. Nearly 1/3 of Latinos in the United States voted for Trump. So to characterize me as equating the white working class with the working class is simply a deliberate, dishonest misreading of my book.
And so, Michael, what they're saying is that you are discounting, or anybody who supports working class right-wing populism is discounting that economic anxiety is not really why people voted for Trump, that it is all about racism. Now, I mean, what's the counter to that?
Well, let me say, for one thing, I'm not defending right-wing populism.
Yes.
In the book, I defend what I call democratic pluralism as an alternative, both to populism, which I think is a dead end in terms of politics and policy, but also to technocratic neoliberalism, which is the establishment system that the populists are rebelling against. And I argue in the book, for those, unlike this New York Times book reviewer, willing to read the book and characterize it accurately, that we have a split labor market. The reason many immigrants and minorities side with the mostly white managerial class in the big cities is because their conditions are getting better. It's better than they were under segregation. In the case of old stock minorities, better than their home countries in the case of immigrants. So, this is not a defense of Trumpism against Clintonism or whatever. It's a scholarly analysis of what is happening in politics on both sides of the Atlantic right now and what the possible futures are.
Yeah.
How does, though, on the right, white identity politics play into the fact that the white working class has consolidated with the Republican Party, and how does identity politics politics within the Democratic Party play into the fact that you have the black and brown working class mostly consolidating around the Democratic Party?
Well, there's no doubt that white identity politics and white racism was a factor in the Republican realignment of the American South. But that took place a generation ago. That's not news. What put Trump in the White House is the shift of working class voters, by no means all of them white, in the Midwest manufacturing states. And this is a new phenomenon. If you look at the rise of populism in the US and the UK, Western Europe, it's concentrated in former industrial areas that were struck heavily by Chinese import competition in the 2000s, where most of the voters used to vote for social democrats or even communists in some cases in Europe and for liberal Democrats in the United States. So I think you have to distinguish this Nixon era realignment of the old segregationist Dixiecrats into the Republicans and this new phenomenon. It really is new and different, and it's related to deindustrialization.
One of the things you talk about is about the need for particularly strong unions. Now, why is that? You know, that's been anathema to the conservative movement now for a long time. I'm not saying you're part of that, but your advice for how we settle a new class war is that unions and workers have to have power. Why is that?
Well, to begin with, there is a close correlation between relative economic inequality and unions. But even apart from that, unions are one of the few organizations in which ordinary high school educated working class people have, or at least in the past had, some kind of voice and agency. Conservatives, at least free market conservatives, tend not to like unions. Progressives tend not to like churches, particularly traditional churches, but much of the working class on both sides of the Atlantic belongs to traditional churches and supports unions. So that if your interest is maximizing the institutional power of the working class, individual members of the working class, unlike those of the elite, they don't have money, they don't have educational resources, they don't have expertise that they can mobilize for influence. The only thing members of the working class have is numbers. And those numbers can be expressed through various mass membership organizations. Unions are one, religious institutions are another, local political bodies are a third. But unless working class people can unite and have some kind of organizational clout, you're going to get this situation like we have now, where you have a lot of working class people are just disconnected from the political system, and sometimes they just drop out and they don't vote. Other times they cast a protest vote, and neither is a healthy situation.
Right.
Yeah, so you say populism is a dead end. What is the alternative? What does that look like more specifically?
Well, the alternative is rebuilding a kind of consensus democracy where the premise is that Americans and those in other democracies are naturally divided into groups. The first thing you have to acknowledge is that differences are legitimate. There are class differences on trade and immigration. There are religious differences on social issues. One side is not good, one side is not evil. We have to coexist in a single system. And therefore, you have to replace both the technocratic neoliberal approach that brilliant academics and nonprofit folks will come up with the right scientific answer for all problems. That's one non-democratic approach. The other non-democratic approach, you could call it pseudo-democratic. It's the populist, that they're the simple answers, the people are for them, the elites, the interests are against them. No, we have to have constant institutionalized negotiation, some of it within the legislature and within government, some of it outside, and that's why collective bargaining has a place. It's why there's a place for members of different faith traditions to be brought together on government boards, doing oversight of education and of media and so on. So peaceful coexistence is the goal. It's not the annihilation of the other team.
Well, Michael, thank you so much for joining us. Really interesting.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you. Congratulations.
Appreciate it.
Absolutely.
We'll have more rising for you after this.